But we want to turn to another huge story in the world, certainly for our hemisphere, and that is the massive blaze that took place in Cuba. It has taken place in Matanzas after a lightning strike hit a large oil refinery there on the island. It's been obviously a huge blaze. I'm sure many people have seen the photos of just unbelievable size of this fire, which has had a huge impact on the country writ large. And we are very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Carlos Fernandez de Cosio, who is the Deputy Foreign Minister of the country of Cuba. Minister, thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure being here.
Well, the first thing I wanted to ask you, and really the pleasure is all ours, is I think, many people in the U.S. have probably seen a lot of the photos, and they get a sense that this is a big deal. But what role does this refinery play in the broader sort of Cuban fuel and power system, and what's the impact that this fire is really, really having on the island?
Well, first of all, actually, it's not a refinery. It is a deposit and a fuel terminal in the Bay of Matanzas. The Bay of Matanzas is perhaps the deepest bay of all the bays in Cuba. And 30, 40 years ago, we decided to establish there our main facility for the import of fuel. You must know that Cuba is not capable of producing all the fuel that we need. We can produce some, which is used mainly by electricity, around 30% of our electricity, but the rest is we need to import it. And that is the main terminal and the main storage place for the fuel that we import. That's the importance that it has.
Maybe break down how this has impacted Cuba. Before we get to the issue of sanctions and things like this, how has this particular incident impacted the power sector in Cuba?
It has a huge impact in general because of the cost of the amount of resources that are lost. But first of all, we've had loss of life. It is not close to where people live. It's an industrial sector, but it's quite close to the city of Matanzas, and therefore the fumes and the smoke does affect the population. But also we've had loss of life of some of the firefighters there that went initially to fight the blaze. The blaze is currently under control. It's not over yet. There are still specific areas with flames that would take a few days to put them out, but it's already under control. And the firefighters are capable of working in the area. It's not anymore an area of an ongoing crisis. But the loss of property, the loss of technology there is huge. We've lost 4 of the 8 main tankers there. There are many more, but there are 8 huge tankers. We've lost them. And the tankers themselves is an important infrastructure loss, but also the amount of fuel that has been lost. As you know, the U.S. has in policy a practice of trying to deprive Cuba from importing fuel. And therefore, it has become very difficult and very costly for us to import fuel. The amount of gallons of fuel that we lost, which we have not estimated yet, is huge, and that has a huge financial cost for our country. And it comes in a moment in which we have problems with the availability specifically of diesel that is used in some of our, what we call our distributed power plants. But we also have a huge problem of electricity, not because of the lack of fuel, but because of lack of maintenance, of outdated technology, and the capacity to generate in many of the plants that we have, as a result of the many difficulties that Cuba has to obtain credit, to engage economically with other countries and with other companies around the world.
Well, I really appreciate you laying that out for us so systematically, and I, this is to some degree implied, but I was hoping you could talk about, what is the impact of this U.S. blockade on Cuba, of the ability to, both, I think, address the fire, recover from it, but also some of the other problems that you've laid out in terms of economic transactions.
Well, the economic blockade, or in the U.S. they call it the economic embargo, but it's beyond that. It's not only that the U.S. prohibited selling to Cuba any product, to export anything to Cuba, with the exception of foods under very restricted and limited conditions. And it also prohibits the export to Cuba from any country around the world of any product produced anywhere if it has 10% or more of US origin, implying spare parts, software, technology, raw materials, whatever. It also prohibits the import into the United States of any product produced in Cuba or produced in any country around the world if it has 10% or more of Cuban components. Now, in a globalized world, that has a huge impact on the economy. To give you an idea, Cuba cannot buy planes, airplanes, civilian aircraft anywhere because it is impossible to find any aircraft produced in this world that does not have at least 10% of US technology. But even goes beyond that. The US, by law, the State Department has, by law, the obligation to go around and look for Cuban financial and commercial transactions any country with any country in the world, anywhere, to try to put obstacles to it. So it becomes very difficult for Cuba to obtain financing for its exports or for its imports, or to obtain credit. But in addition to that, the US, because it has included Cuba illegitimately in a list of the Department of State of countries that allegedly practice or promote terrorism, it implies that an important amount of financial institutions around the world would deny Cuba any cooperation, any contact, or deny any transaction with Cuba because of fear of being punished by the US, even though they know that Cuba is not a country that sponsors terrorism and that the list of the State Department is unilateral, it's illegitimate, it has no international recognition, but yet they fear that they could be punished by the United States. All of that has a tremendous impact on our efforts to develop our economy, and it poses huge limitations to obtain technology, to purchase, to buy, to obtain credit, to find companies ready to participate, for example, in the building or the repairing or infrastructure. This was shown under COVID and is shown now when we're having this huge problem with our power grid.
You know, after this latest horrible disaster took place, so many countries reached out to try to send help. I think the Americans made a statement. I'm curious if the United States has done anything to try to assist Cuba. I won't be surprised if you say no to that. But furthermore, has there been, from the Biden administration specifically, any sort of move or even suggestion that they would be willing to loosen the noose, if you will, on Cuba? Or has this just been sort of a repeat of the Trump administration? Or has it been worse?
First, I have to say that the response of many countries and people in general around the world has been immense. The amount of solidarity that we have felt. I have to point out the cases of Mexico and Venezuela, which immediately sent help. Mexico alone sent, I think it was 16 planes with personnel, technology, resources, equipment, and Venezuela did something very similar. Their help, both Venezuela and Mexico, has been crucial in our ability to control the blaze as it is now and to put it out and to avoid a major disaster that could have occurred. We have also received a message of solidarity from other countries, condolences, and some level of help in medical supplies and so on. With the US government, we had communication from the beginning. They reached out, expressed their condolences, and they spoke of the readiness to assist Cuba with technical advice. And since then, we've had several communications. That's more or less what there has been in place, and we have continued to have communication because still we need to recover from the impact and the consequences of what happened. And hopefully there would be cooperation coming from the US. I cannot discard it. And I can say that from the US, many people and many organizations both sent help, expressed their solidarity, which we appreciate greatly.
It just seems to me that really, obviously, I think we could say this any day, but certainly after, such a major disaster like this, that the only real way, or maybe not the only real way, but that if the U.S. really wants to help, that the best way would be to lift the blockade and to lift these measures. I just wonder what you think about that.
That would be the most meaningful, the most coherent, and the moral thing to do, I would say, in this juncture. If you cannot lift it as a whole, the president of the United States has a lot of leverage in his hand, and there's a lot that he can do to alleviate the current conditions. There are many actions that he could take that will at least alleviate the current condition, and with it to make a difference.
One other thing that it just strikes me about this is I can remember like it was yesterday. I don't know if that says how old I am, but when Hurricane Katrina happened in the United States, which was such a horrible disaster, Cuba was right there almost right away. I think it was like 1,500 doctors, a huge number of people they were offering to the United States, ready to go, fly to New Orleans. Obviously, the country needed it. The U.S. rejected it. And it just seems to me in these sorts of tragic circumstances, when you look at the impact of what the blockade has done in separating the two countries, that it's just a very anti-human, very anti-people policy, and that really, even beyond the tragic times and the disaster times, that both countries and both peoples are really being hurt by these policies day in and day out.
Well, it wouldn't be the first time in history that countries put politics aside, that put political differences aside to try to help in a grave moment of need. We did that, as you say, during Hurricane Katrina. We offered the same on September 2001 after the attacks in New York and Washington, and we offered blood. We offered our airports. We offered our airspace if it was needed. It wasn't used at the time, but we offered it immediately, and we did so in Katrina, as you mentioned, and on other occasions it has happened. In the case of Cuba, it has been very and extremely rare for there to have been a gesture from the United States for something like that to happen. In 2001, after two hurricanes, there was an offer of support by the then George W. Bush administration when we had a very difficult moment, and we were able to find a way of cooperation and exceptions to be made in the very severe policy of blockade against Cuba. So it's not rare around the world, but it is rare in the case of U.S. and Cuba.
It seems as though in at least the last maybe 10, 15 years, maybe a little bit longer than that, the sort of Cuba model, the blockade model, has been imposed increasingly on countries around the world that the U.S. views as adversaries. And so I'm just curious if, and maybe this is a little bit of a pivot here, but I'm curious if on an international level, you see a kind of growing solidarity, maybe growing group of countries that are coming together more and more as a result of this maybe overzealous use of sanctions. And again, like I called it, the Cuba model. And of course here I'm talking about Syria, Venezuela, Iran, and the list goes on now. Russia is like a huge, a huge portion of the sanctions are being targeted on Russia. China is increasingly being sanctioned. And it just seems to me, you see a sort of a bit of this in the group of Friends of the UN Charter. But do you feel as though maybe we're entering an era where the U.S.'s use of this policy, of this tool, this weapon of economic warfare is actually perhaps backfiring in a way?
Well, it is true that the U.S. has become addicted to the use of economic coercive measures, or sanctions, as you call them. And they're increasingly doing so. It has become a definitive characteristic of U.S. foreign policy for the past 20 to 30 years. It's not new. The U.S. has been applying this type of measure perhaps since the 19th century. but never at the level and never with the frequency and the repetition that it does it today. And it would lead, and it increasingly leads to countries to mistrust trade, commercial activity with the U.S., and to protect themselves. Any government around the world would see that sooner or later they can be the subject of U.S. coercive measures. They will, of course, try to take measures with their banking operations or commercial operations so that they can be protected eventually from the impact of U.S. sanctions, of U.S. coercive measures. And it would lead, and it can lead, to a separation of two worlds. One in which countries can deal and would deal with the United States, but they will increasingly find alternative avenues in the case they would eventually come under the punishment of U.S. economic sanctions.
One thing I want to ask as well is, in terms of moving forward, what are some of the biggest challenges Cuba is going to be facing? I mean, I know we've talked about power outages and other things like that, but, moving forward now as the blaze is contained and looking to the process of recovery, what are some of the biggest challenges you all will be facing and trying to overcome in the coming weeks?
Huge challenges. I'll tell you more or less how we see it. We have an ongoing U.S. system of sanctions, the most comprehensive that has ever existed against any country ever, and it's been there for the past 62 years. Greater than any other that exists today. The greatest it comes is the one against Cuba. There's no indication in the horizon that is going to change anytime soon, at least that is not going to change significantly. So we are convinced that we need to try to sustain our economy, to develop it, and to find prosperity in spite of the existence of this U.S. economic coercive measures of the economic blockade. And we have to do it with the capacity of Cubans to resist, and to do it with creativity, with the talent that we have developed in our country, the education and the capacity that Cubans have proven, for example, to put out and to control this blaze in spite of the fact that we lacked the technology that exists in some other places, that some experts that saw what was happening and gave opinions said that it would be impossible for Cuba with the resources that we had, the material resources to put that out, and yet we have been able to control it. It is a demonstration of what we can do, as we did with COVID when we put our human resources together. Now that is easier said than done. It's a big challenge for us. We need to find the investments by the end of the year at least, to be able to recover our capacity in terms of electrical generation. We need to improve our capacity to produce foodstuffs so we can reduce the dependence on food imports. We need to increase investment, and that is very difficult, in alternative sources of energy so that we don't have to depend on hydrocarbons as we do today. And we have to make sure that all these challenges do not stop and do not prevent us from putting in place the types of economic and social transformations that we have committed to since the past 5 to 6 years in terms of the Constitution, legislation, economic transformations, and so that we can put our country in the path to the future that we are seeking, ensuring that we can continue to have social justice as we have known, and even to improve that social justice, knowing that our adversary, the United States, does not want to change that condition, and also looking at the immense political challenges and threats that are occurring within the United States, the huge problems within that society, that many of the friends that with which we relate and that come to us and tell us, you see what's happening to you, just feel what's happening to us in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our jobs, in our families, in many parts of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, Minister, I know you must be very busy, but before we let you go here, any final words you would like to leave our audience with?
That we will continue to try to extend as many links and as many bonds as possible with people in the United States. We know that the U.S. government and their policy, it's in the way. We'll try to go around it. but find ways. We know that we need to create greater contact, cultural, religious, economic, just friendliness, whichever way possible to engage with people in the United States.
Well,
Thank you
Deputy
very much
Foreign
for this
Minister
opportunity.
Carlos Fernandez de Cosio, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.